Good morning, everyone. So, in the last lesson, we looked at the the tools Stalin used to maintain his power. Today, we will look at the toughest challenge ever faced by the Soviet Union, the German invasion during the Second World War. The Soviet Union was the country that paid the highest price in terms of human lives during the war, with 27 million people dead. Yet, the Soviets were also the most important actor during World War II, and the Eastern Front proved to be the most difficult nut to crack for the German army, which tried unsuccessfully to replicate the same exploit that allowed it to conquer France in just a few weeks. Today, we're going to look at how the Soviet Union survived the war, paving the way for its transformation from a reject of the international community into an atomic superpower that shaped history of the world in the second half of the 20th century. In particular, we're going to look at the following points. So, some background of the war, some details about Operation Barbarossa, then we're going to look about the Soviet weaknesses and the Soviet strengths, finally at the role of the man of steel himself, Stalin, during the war, then Stalingrad, Kursk and the Soviet counteroffensive, and we will conclude by looking at the end of the war, when the red flag of the Soviet Union flew over the German Reichstag, the German parliament. So, let's start with some background before we look into how the war affected the Soviet Union, we need to put it in the historical context and see how and why the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. The first thing we need to understand is that there was an unbridgeable ideological hatred between the Nazis and the Soviets, who espoused different ways of looking at the world and who had entirely different premises when it came to understanding the world. To simplify a very complicated topic, the Nazis, on the one hand, were ferociously nationalistic and believed that the German race, in inverted commas, was inherently superior, especially when compared to what they deemed to be the so-called inferior Slavic race. Many of the Germans, still blamed the German defeat in World War I on the communist traitors, and many of them had also fought in the Freikorps, the nationalist groups of veterans who fought against the communists during the 1920s in Germany, during that sort of semi-civil war that shook Germany immediately after the war. The ideal state of the Nazis was racially homogeneous. Only Germans, only pure Aryan Germans, completely without dissent, so all major decisions were taken by the Führer himself, and aggressively militaristic. The Soviets, on the other hand, were communist. They believed that the state was some kind of promised land for the workers and that there should be no private property, meaning that essentially everything was owned and managed by the state, by the government. They also did whatever they could to minimize the impact of factors like religion, ethnicities and cultural differences, with sort of mixed results. The ideal state for the Soviets was completely homogeneous, yes, but in terms of social class, not of ethnicity and race, okay? So everybody had the same, there were no differences in terms of wealth, and everybody was a member of the working class. It was completely without dissent, so all major decisions were taken by the General Secretary of the Communist Party himself, and was also aggressively militaristic, so okay, maybe there were some similarities after all. Nevertheless, despite those similarities and especially the differences, the Nazis and the Soviets agreed in 1939 with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and you can see here in the picture the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov shaking the hand of the German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, and they agreed to partition Poland, with Germany attacking from the west and the Soviet from the east. The honeymoon between these two ideologically opposing countries did not last very long, and by 1941 Hitler, who had just finished annexing most of Europe, decided to devote his attention to the big, red, scary monster that he had on his eastern frontier. How did he do that? Well, in the German army, the Wehrmacht, launched Operation Barbarossa in summer 1914. It was named after a particularly noteworthy German emperor of the Middle Ages, about which I hope to be able to speak soon, and this operation was the largest land invasion in human history, pitching about 4 million Axis soldiers, mostly German, but there were also many Italians, Romanians and Hungarians, against 3 million Soviet soldiers. The front of the operation went from the Baltic Sea to the north to the Black Sea in the south, covering a staggering 6,000 kilometers. Its main aim was to replicate the success of the Blitzkrieg in France, using fast and aggressive units made entirely of armored tanks and vehicles as a spearhead to pierce the enemy line, encircle the enemy soldiers from different sides, and either kill them or take them prisoner, often both. The Germans did not have any winter equipment with them, because they were sure they would reach Moscow before the first snow. Seeing the speed, the absolutely incredible speed with which they crushed through the Soviet lines, any external observer would have easily believed them. So, why? Why did that happen? How did the Wehrmacht destroy Soviet resistance so painlessly? Why did the Red Army not put up a better fight, at least initially? We mentioned one of the most important reasons in the last lesson, the purges. The Soviet army had been purged of its most experienced and capable officers by Stalin, who saw them as a potential threat to his absolute rule of the Soviet Union. Without those experienced officers, who had gained their rank by fighting in the Red Army during the Civil War or during the invasion of Poland, the Soviet army was doomed to have a huge lack in leadership, especially when compared to the officer corps of Nazi Germany. Another one of Stalin's direct responsibilities was the deployment of the army. Stalin believed in offensive warfare, in preemptive offensive warfare, and was determined to strike first at Germany. So he ordered the deployment of most of his units in an offensive line, without making any kind of defensive preparations or employing significant reserves. The line was thin and it was poorly prepared, so the Nazis did not have a very hard time crushing through it with their panzers. Russia's size and backwardness in terms of infrastructure, they did not have railways and roads, was a huge hindrance which prevented the adequate deployment of reinforcement and of supplies to the first lines. This backwardness also extended to the industrial capacity of the country, which was, incidentally, located mostly in the areas of Western Russia targeted by the Nazis. At the beginning of the war, Soviet equipment tended to be less advanced, let's say, than its German counterpart. And while the gap was almost filled by the end of the war, the Soviets kept relying more on quantity than on quality. A good example is the use of explosive anti-tank dogs. In order to face the German tanks, the Soviets strapped bombs onto dogs, trained them to run towards tanks, and then as soon as they were near or under a tank, someone would make the dog explode. Unfortunately, they trained them with Russian tanks, so as soon as the battle started, they started running towards the Russian T-34s rather than towards the German panzers, and this led to some tragic results, and those dogs died in vain, so the program was scrapped. Here you see a picture of one of these good dogs. However, we all know that it was the Soviets that eventually came out victorious from this conflict. Spoilers. So, how did that happen? What did they have that allowed them to push back the Germans and the Italians and the Romanians and the Hungarians back to where they had come from? The first element is one of the most classically Russian factors in military history, the combination of geography and climate. If you go to Russia and try to drive through Russia, you will notice three things. First, Russia is big. Second, no matter how far you go, there's always more Russia. Third, Russia just never ends. This strategic depth is one of the factors that allowed the Soviet Union to survive the initial attack by the Nazis, who, despite the very meticulous German preparation, were not ready to travel those absolutely colossal distances. Another factor that made these distances even more unbearable was the lack of infrastructure. We said that the Soviet Union did not have any roads and very few railways, and while this hindered the Soviet defenses, it also hindered the German advance. They relied on moving infantry and moving vehicles fast and precisely. However, they could not do that because there were no road to move the vehicles, and especially after pretty much the entire country turned into mud with the first rains in September, October, the tanks just sank into the mud, and this contributed to slow down the German advance. And that's when the most powerful ally of the Russians through history comes into play, General Winter. Russia is not just big, it's also very, very cold, to put it mildly. The Swedes, who are not a people used to a tropical climate, let's say, learned it during the failed invasion in 1708. The Grand Army of Napoleon learned it as well, as it was slowly whittled down to just a fraction of its initial strength during the retreat of 1812. The Nazis learned it on their own skin as they spent the winter in the front line in 1941. By the way, this is a picture of General Winter from a propaganda poster made in World War I. It's not period appropriate, but I think it's the coolest image of General Winter I could find, so you're gonna take it. Now, the size of Russia had also allowed it, throughout the ages, to have one of the largest reserves of raw materials, so oils and metals, and military manpower in the world. So they had a lot of resources with which to build equipment and a lot of people to use that equipment. In World War I, the Russian army was noteworthy more for its size than for its efficiency, and the situation was really not much different in World War II, especially at the beginning, but even towards the end. As much as the Germans could kill wave after wave after wave of Soviet soldiers, Stalin could always summon more of them, apparently out of thin air. This was also made possible by the existence of a secret army, let's say, stationed on the eastern frontier of the Soviet Union, in Mongolia. It had been fighting an undeclared and almost invisible war in the middle of absolutely nowhere against the Japanese Empire, in the border between Mongolia and Manchuria. The German intelligence had no idea that this army even existed, and the Wehrmacht, the German army, was dumbfounded when it saw this Eastern Soviet army led by General Zhukov appearing seemingly out of thin air as the Germans were in view of the city of Moscow. In all of this, what was the role of Stalin himself? So, initially he had absolute control over the army, and his actions, combined with his irresponsible, to say the least, purges of the army officers, led to the catastrophically ineffective response to the initial invasion. As soon as the situation got a bit more under control, however, his leadership began to play a more important role in the recovery of lost ground. To prevent the factories, for example, from falling into German hands, Stalin ordered them to be literally taken apart and rebuilt far away from the front line, a decision which allowed the USSR to keep producing tanks and weapons. He was also able to ensure that the Allies, Britain and later the United States, gave an important economic support to the Soviets through the American Lend-Lease program. Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor had forced the Americans into the war, the Americans had begun assisting Britain and the Soviet Union financially by giving them money, vehicles and tanks. By the end of the war, the Soviets had received something like $11 billion in loans and in military equipment, and 1/3 of all the Russian military vehicles were made in America. On a less felicitous note, let's say, Stalin was also thinking about the future of the Soviet Union as a world power with a strong sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Already by 1940, he was planning ways to destroy the governing classes of Eastern European countries that could later be included in the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance guided by the Soviets during the Cold War. The most terrible example of this policy was the Katyn massacre, where 22,000 Polish officers, almost I think the entire command of the Polish army, it's a huge number of trained officers, was killed by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. Similar massacres would happen all over Europe as the Soviets sought to replace the local governing classes with the communist puppets as they advanced through Eastern Europe. So, now let's go back to the front line. In the winter of 1942, the High Command of the German Army was painfully aware that the war machine needed oil to work. A modern war needs oil. Okay, it's used as fuel for tanks, cars and planes and ships. So no oil, no lightning-fast advance. No lightning-fast advance, no German victory. So the Germans needed oil. They needed oil, and they realized that the Soviets had lots of it around the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea in modern-day Georgia and Azerbaijan. As the German army group south tried to penetrate the plains north of the Caucasus, the German Sixth Army was blocked at the city of Stalingrad. It was a fundamental strategic target for both the Germans and the Soviets. It was located along the Vodka, a huge navigable river that flows between the Caspian Sea and inner Russia, and controlled the access to the Caspian oil fields. You needed to control Stalingrad if you wanted to have safe access to the oil you needed so much. It was also, interestingly, named after Stalin, Stalingrad, the city of Stalin, making it a highly symbolic objective for both armies. The Russians did not want to lose the city named after their godly leader, and the Germans wanted to capture it as a symbolic gesture as well. Without going too much into detail, the Germans were almost able to take Stalingrad, but just when the last pocket of resistance was about to fall, they found themselves enveloped by another huge Soviet army, which prevented them from receiving reinforcements or supplies. They were attacking the people inside, but they were also surrounded. The Germans were attacking the resistance, where they were also attacked by the army outside the city. It did not end well for the Germans. In one of his last communications to him, Hitler gave the German general von Paulus the rank of Reichsmarschall, knowing that no German marshal in history had ever surrendered to an enemy. It didn't work, and von Paulus was forced to lay down his weapon after months and months of ferocious fighting. 2 million people died during just that one battle, which is still remembered as one of the bloodiest and most violent military engagements in human history. Seeing that the offensive in the southeast wasn't cutting it, the Germans attempted a last-ditch tank offensive near the city of Kursk in order to break the Soviet lines and drive all the way towards Moscow. But by then, the Soviets had been able to somehow bridge the gaps in terms of equipment, technology and leadership, and were able to repel them. After the failed offensive at Kursk, the Germans were not in a position to attack anymore in the east. Now it was the Soviets' turn to push them back out of the motherland. So, there is a very nice series of YouTube videos on the Eastern Front of World War II, which explains in detail how the Soviets were able to pursue the Germans all the way to Berlin, so I will not discuss it in detail. Look it up. However, it must be noted that despite the atrocities of the Stalinist regime and all the absolutely inhuman crimes committed in the name of Soviet communism, it was the Soviet Union that carried the brunt of the fight against Nazism. By the end of the war, the USSR had lost 27 million people, either from battle, starvation or from Nazi atrocities. At the beginning of the war, the Nazis had been able to capture millions of Soviet soldiers. They would just encircle them, prevent them from receiving reinforcement, and wait for their surrender. As the war went on, they realized that they didn't need them, and they left them to die of starvation or just killed them. The civilians were also often targeted by the invading forces. The Nazis had, as we said, an ideological and racial hatred for the Russians because they were A, communist, and B, inferior Slavs, as they saw it. They believed that they were, as we said, an inferior race, worth only of being exploited or exterminated. As the war started going the wrong way for them, for the Germans, it's no surprise that they just began massacring most of the civilian population. It is also not a surprise that what for us is World War II, for the Russians is the Great Patriotic War, and that everything that happened outside the Eastern Front is seen by them as a mere sideshow compared with the apocalyptic destruction that was taking place on Soviet soil. The war had also another effect. It showed the world that the USSR was not a power to be trifled with, and that its military, industrial and political capabilities had gone a long way from the days of the Tsars. World War II was what showed the world that the Soviet Union was not just the communist rogue state which everyone in the international community had looked at with suspicion in the previous decades. Instead, it showed everyone that it was a global power to be reckoned with. We'll discuss the effects of these developments in the next lesson at the beginning of the Cold War. So that's it for today. Looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.